corporate trust business, which included Asia Pacific, EMEA, and the Americas regions. Prior to joining the Bank of New York Mellon, Samir spent 11 years at JP Morgan Chase in its corporate trust division, with expatriate business management assignments in Hong Kong, London, and in New York. He also spent 4 years with Bankers Trust in New York, covering the US public utilities and global project finance sectors within their corporate trust group. Samir is a member of the Bank of New York Mellon Operating Committee, the EMEA Management Committee, and is also a member of the bank's Global Diversity Council. Samir holds BS and MS degrees in chemical engineering and MBA in finance, all from Columbia University, New York. Samir, you are very privileged. Thank you for being with us.
So, first of all, I just want to tell everybody, I did apply to IIM. I didn't get in, so which is why I went to Columbia University. By the way, I think you guys, this must be probably the 80 smartest people in the building today. Of course, there's only about 85 people.
That's good.
So I don't know about the compliment or whatever. It's just as that. So again, thank you very much, for allowing me to be here. And I realized, originally somebody asked me for this. Do you have a PowerPoint presentation that you want to present? And I said, PowerPoints are generally for people that have no power and have no point to make. I realize many of you here are management consultants,
I know.
so probably like sacrilege, right? What I just said. So anyway, so all in good fun, right? So let me just give you a little bit of background on myself. So before I start giving people hints about leadership and whatnot, you might be asking, why the hell are you talking to us? So maybe I'll just give you a little bit of background, set the context, and my own experience, and then then we'll open it up to some questions. So we're going to have a little bit of fun. So it's not, please don't take everything too seriously, but please take a little bit seriously. So we'll have some fun together. So just by way of background, I was born in India. I was born in Madras. So my mother tongue is Telugu, but I learned Tamil because obviously I lived in Chennai till I was about 11 years old. And my parents moved to the U.S. when I was about 11. Most of my high school was in Connecticut. I went to the third oldest high school in the United States, a school called Hopkins Grammar School. It was founded in 1660. So the school's been around for about 350 years, more than that. So up through high school. And of course, being in Connecticut, my parents, they wanted us to, I have an older brother and a younger sister, and they wanted us all to go to Yale University, which is a very good school. And we wanted to go to any place other than Yale University, because Yale University was 3 miles from where we lived. And you can imagine my mother coming every weekend, with dal chawal and, into the dorm. So the compromise for us was Columbia University. It was 60 miles away from home, and it was close enough that we can go visit, but far enough it was troublesome for them to come into the city. So it was very strategic. We have a long Columbia legacy. My brother went there, I went there, my sister went there, my wife actually went to Barnard, which is where we met. She was also about 5 years old when she came to the U.S. She grew up in Western Pennsylvania. And, we dated for 4 years in college. Of course, my parents didn't know about that. But, then they found out afterwards. And, we got married. So we've been married almost 28 years now. And, the second generation is also there. So my brother-in-law, now my nephew, my niece, and now actually my daughter, my second daughter, she's at Columbia. She's a freshman. And what's interesting is she's on the same dorm, on the same floor, 2 doors down from where I lived my freshman year. So, she said, "Daddy, what did you do your freshman year?" And I said, "I'm never going to tell you what I did." But anyway, so it's great. So we have 3 kids. We have my oldest daughter is in University of Chicago. She's a junior. She's pre-med. She wants to do medicine. My second daughter, she's a freshman. She's studying economics. She wants to be like Daddy, I think, in business or finance or banking, something like that. And we have a son who's 10. He's in 10th grade, sorry. He's about 15. And he's a very good all-arounder. He's good in science, he's good in math. He's also a very good jazz musician. And he plays jazz at Lincoln Center. So clearly he's smart like my wife. And so that's helpful. So, and again, I'm kind of giving you this background just because there is a point to this. The other thing is, our 3 kids, again, I went to Columbia, I studied chemical engineering, got my undergrad, my master's. I actually worked as an engineer for a number of years. I didn't go right into finance or banking. I actually worked as an engineer. And again, like all good things, all good decisions, they're made by somebody else. In my case, it's my wife. So, when I finished my MBA, when I finished my chemical engineering, I worked for a few years, and then I went back to get my MBA from Columbia. And at the time, she was at NYU. She still had 1 more year to finish college, and I was 1 year ahead of her. And so she said, so I was applying for a lot of jobs in the oil and gas industry. So I was getting jobs with Exxon and Mobil in places like Texas, Oklahoma, Louisiana. And she was at NYU, Stern, so she still had 1 more year. We were newlyweds. So she said, I don't want you to go to Texas, so find a chemical engineering job in Manhattan. I said, that's a little challenging. Even I couldn't do that. So I said, we'll take a look, we'll look around. And that's really how I got into banking. So my first job was at Bankers Trust. Back in those days, in 1990, Bankers Trust used to be a big lender to the energy project finance world. So they had all these bankers, MBAs, lending money and whatnot, but none of them had ever walked in a chemical plant or, a power plant. So my kind of entree into banking was, I said, look, I have an MBA, but I also have an engineering background, so if you're lending a lot of money, you should have somebody that has some common sense around, what's being built. And so that's kind of how I got into banking, and I was there for about 4 years. Now, one thing I will tell you, and again, I think everybody has a certain calling in life. Some people know it very early, some people know it much later, and some people never know it. And I think when I was a kid, maybe about 7, 8 years old, I really wanted to travel. I really wanted to see the world. I remember my uncle who used to live in America, and he would come and he would show us all these pictures as a kid. I remember seeing a picture of him on a camel in front of one of the pyramids in Egypt, and thinking, wow, I'd love to go to Egypt. I'd love to go to all these, wonderful places and travel. Of course, nowadays everybody markets that as, having a good global IQ or, global intelligence, right? But, back in those days, I just wanted to travel and I wanted to see the world. So, and again, a lot of what you do, especially Indian parents, if you all have Indian parents like I do. There's a couple of sort of chosen professions, right? So you can be a doctor and be a really good kid, or you can be an engineer, or if you're a bit of a loser, you can go to finance or banking. But that was sort of the extent, right? So that was sort of the purview. And so, my dad said, study chemical engineering, and this way you have all your pre-med stuff covered. And if you don't become a doctor, you have an engineering background as a fallback. So I was like, oh yeah, that makes sense. It's a nice fallback. I'll be a chemical engineer as a backup. So that was really my backup career. So again, I think some of this is resonating with some of you. Maybe you had this conversation with your parents. But after actually college, I had to actually have a conversation with my parents. And I said, I'm not going to be a doctor. I'm going to travel. I'm going to see the world and whatever. So it was confrontational, but anyway, I won out. So long story short, after about 4 years at BT, I really was not getting the opportunity to do that. So I said I'm going to leave the firm, and I went to Chase Manhattan Bank at the time, which eventually merged with Chemical Bank, and then JP Morgan, then JPM Chase. And and at that time I had a pretty enlightened manager, and and I told him, I said, look, I want to join the firm, but I really want to see the world. And what do you think? He said, well, Chase is a big global organization. There should be lots of opportunities. Spend a year in headquarters in New York, and then we'll see what happens. And as they say, the rest is history. So I spent a year in New York, and I spent about almost 8.5 years abroad. So I spent 4 years in Hong Kong, 4 years in London, and and we came back. And by the way, when we first went, I was about I guess my 30s, early 30s. My eldest daughter was 18 months, so it was pretty easy to move. She was born in New Jersey. My second daughter was born in Hong Kong. My son was born in London. That's when my wife said, no more new cities, because every time we go to a new city, we have a new kid. So, we stopped, go to new cities, and we're safely back in New Jersey, just to, in case you're wondering, we're all back in New Jersey, we're pretty safe. And so, 3 kids, global, and, spent a lot of years, and then I joined the Bank of New York about 10 years ago. And again, I think when I joined the bank, I think it was at a different part of my career. Because I would say with JP Morgan Chase, it was more about learning and absorbing and understanding, working in Asia, working in Singapore is not the same as working in Thailand or, China, or, or working in London is not the same as working in Germany or, dealing with the French. So again, I think that was for me very formative, it really helped me. And then in the last 10 years at the bank, I think I was at a different phase in my career. So the last 10 years was really more around constructing, taking all of that experience that I had and sort of putting that together in ways that was helpful, to the company. So again, I think, it's interesting, when I reflect back, it's easy to kind of paint a picture, but, when you're in the moment, it's not always obvious what it is that you're trying to paint, right? So that's, one of the things that, you kind of have to learn and listen and adapt as you go on in time. And so again, I just wanted to paint that, a little bit of background. So my current job today, just to give you a sense, so the Bank of New York, we have 50,000 employees around the world. We generate about $15 billion in revenue. The group that I run is called Asset Servicing. We have 19,000 employees. We are responsible for about a third of the company's revenue and a third of the company's profit. And we're global. We have staff in, probably 50, 55 different countries. So the group that I represent, that I run, that I'm the CEO of, is roughly 1/3 of the company, for Bank of New York. And again, some of the things I think about is, why did they give me this job, right? Because there are many, many people that they could have, selected. I think one of the parts, or one of the things I think was pretty important was, having that global view, having that global experience. Because if you're going to run a group that with almost 20,000 employees, by definition, they're in 45, 50 different countries. You have to have that cultural context and that emotional IQ to really understand, what some of these differences are. But then more importantly, how do you bring it together, right? It's easy to talk about all the differences and why the Indians are different than the Chinese and why they're different from the Brits. But, what you have to try to do is really try to bring that all together in a common frame of reference. I think, some of our speakers were talking about that in their, the last presentation. It's not just about the differences, but, can you create a vision that's compelling, that can unite, everybody to a common purpose and, common understanding. So anyway, that's sort of the background. And again, leadership is kind of a weird, it's a weird thing, right? You don't know if you have it or not, but when you have it, people sometimes recognize it, and it's not always apparent why. And I think over the years, I've kind of put together a little sort of, I would call my David Letterman top 10 list of what I think are leadership tips. And so maybe I'll go through that. One other thing I will say to you guys is, over the years, I have always looked for 2 or 3 characteristics in jobs. And I would say the 2 things are probably the fact, I always look for global assignments. So if there was a global versus a local assignment, I always tended to do that. And you have to let your managers know that, right? People don't have ESP. So you have to let them know you're interested, that you're willing and able to travel and, try different things. So I've always kind of gravitated towards that. And then the other thing that I've always kind of gravitated to is, sometimes people call it change management. I call it turnarounds. But really, taking tough situations and turning it around, or building new things, and but really, organizations that require a lot of change, is really kind of what I focus on. So within the bank, I've been very fortunate to get those types of assignments, in the last 10 years, and so that's something that's part of my things that I like that I enjoy, that I think I can be pretty effective at. So I'll go through, my top 10 list, and maybe some of this will resonate, with some of you. And I'll throw some stories in to kind of, maybe illustrate some of these points. So, first, I guess, number one, management, kind of what I try to do is always hire great people. Hopefully I'm a good example of that. No, that's false modesty. I mean, I think all of you guys in this room, if you're IIM graduates, understand what that means. You're only as good as the people, the talent you have in your organization. And it's really very important to hire great people and really make that effort. And I think, from the CEO on down, it just starts, and it resonates all the way throughout the organization. So if you're driving that kind of a culture, then people kind of understand what that is, and, and it drives a different type of a behavior. So again, I think that's very, very important. And as part of that is not just having great people, but it's really about having great succession plans, right? Because I think organizations understand that if you're the strongest person on the bench, and all the people that are working for you that are on your bench can't really do your job, then guess what? You are stuck. You may be the smartest guy, but you are stuck because they know that if they move you up, they have to try to, fill a void. So part of what you have to do when you hire great people is really have a takeout succession plan in mind. So you always hire people that you think can potentially be candidates, that can take you out, right? So again, sometimes people look at that and kind of say, oh, that person's smarter than me. Is that job security or insecurity? I actually think it's critical if you want to thrive in senior management. You got to surround yourself with really smart people. Hopefully they're smarter than you. So again, I just offered that as a tip. Second thing the second leadership tip that I would offer is many times, and I've seen this so many places, here and other, companies, customers, clients, people hire for skills. They don't hire for talent. It's an enormous mistake, and it's an enormous wasted opportunity. But always hire for talent. You can always train the skills, right? So now again, you have to kind of understand what that means, right? So you wouldn't want to hire me, a chemical engineer, to be a brain surgeon. That would be a problem, right? So that's not what I'm talking about. So, but there are many, many things in the business context that are pretty transferable. So you really have to hire talent. And that's important because, just as I'm sure all of you are ambitious, and you see yourself doing different things or more things or bigger things in the next 5 or 10 years, the people that you hire, if they're smart, they're going to have the same ambition. So make sure they're talented. Because if they're not, then you have to have a very difficult conversation later explaining why you can't promote them, right? You hired them for a specific job, and they're really good at that job, and they're really not good at any other job, so they're kind of stuck. So guess what? Either they leave, you're frustrated, they're frustrated. So again, I think, this whole idea around talent, I think is a really important thing for you to think about. The third thing, and again, this I think I've kind of thrived on this and kind of made a profession out of this, is really to be able to challenge the status quo. I remember when I got the global CEO job for this business 3 years ago or 2 years ago. 19,000 people. We generate $5 billion in revenues. We're in 50 different countries, and a lot of times people are like, "What are you going to do? What's your first 100 days? Whatnot, right?" And my standard response was, "I'm always going to listen, not just the first 100 days, but always, and I'm always going to challenge the status quo." It's really important, right? That's how you get better, right? If you're satisfied with what you have, that's a recipe for disaster. It's a recipe for becoming stagnant and irrelevant. So it's really important that you have the ability to challenge the status quo, but in a very constructive way, right? Because leadership is not just about breaking things down, but it's really about bringing things together, right? So you have to understand, you can't be a bull in a china shop. You've got to have a subtlety, you've got to have emotional intelligence, but you also have to be able to challenge, how things are done and really get people to understand that that's beneficial, right? So again, that's, I think, a very, very, a good thing to have. The fourth, I would say is, be sensitive to the cultural context. this is actually, very, very important, right? And I think our prior speakers spoke a little bit about that, right? At 199, the L policy